Aisha Monroe sits in a Houston courtroom, wrists bruised from cuffs, facing 10 years for drug trafficking. The jury's verdict nears, but her lawyer, Marcus Tate, plays a grainy video. 2 cops planting cocaine in her car. Gasps erupt. The judge slams her gavel, demanding silence. Aisha exhales, hope flickering, until a juror mutters a slur and Captain Grayson smirks from the gallery. This isn't over. It's just starting, a twisted spiral that'll ruin her. What's next for Aisha? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales like hers. The night was thick with Houston's humid embrace as Aisha Monroe gripped the steering wheel of her beat-up sedan, weaving through the city's quieter edges after a long shift at the foster care agency. Her 6-year-old son, Jamal, slumped in the back seat, his small chest rising and falling under a faded Spider-Man blanket, exhausted from a day at daycare. The clock on the dashboard glowed 10 minutes past 11, its green numbers a faint reminder of the overtime she'd pulled to help a teenage client finish a college application. Aisha's eyes ached, her body begged for rest, but her mind buzzed with pride, knowing that kid had a shot at a future because of her. The street stretched empty before her, lined with flickering streetlights casting long shadows over cracked pavement, the distant hum of downtown fading into a stillness that felt almost peaceful. She adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Jamal's peaceful face, his tiny snores a soft rhythm against the low hum of the engine. 3 more miles, she thought, and they'd be home, safe in their little apartment with its chipped paint and creaky floors. Then, out of the clack, a burst of red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror, sharp and jarring, slicing through the night like a predator's eyes. A police cruiser loomed behind her, its siren shrieking once, a shrill command that jolted her heart into her throat. Aisha's breath caught, her hands tightening on the wheel until her knuckles paled. She flicked on her blinker, slow and deliberate, easing the car to the shoulder of the road, gravel crunching under the tires. Her pulse hammered as she scanned her memory, searching for a misstep. Speeding? No, she'd kept it steady at 35, well under the limit. Tail light? She'd replaced it last week after a co-worker pointed out the flicker. Maybe it's nothing, she told herself, a routine check, but the knot in her stomach twisted tighter, whispering truths she'd learned growing up black in Texas. Nothing was ever routine when lights flashed behind you. Jamal stirred in the back, his sleepy mumble breaking her trance. "Mama?" he whispered, rubbing his eyes. "Shh, baby. It's okay," Aisha murmured, forcing her voice to steady, though her chest felt like it might cave in. She killed the engine, keeping her hands locked at 10 and 2 on the wheel, just as her father had drilled into her decades ago. Visible, still, no sudden moves. The cruiser's spotlight flooded her car, bleaching the interior in harsh white, turning every shadow into a threat. 2 officers stepped out, their silhouettes stark against the glare. The first was tall, stocky, his stride heavy with authority, his face a slab of pale stone under a buzz cut. The second, leaner and younger, hovered a step behind, his posture tense like a dog waiting for a command. Aisha swallowed hard, her mouth dry as cotton, watching them approach in the side mirror. The stocky officer reached her window first, rapping his knuckles against the glass with a force that made her flinch. She rolled it down, the humid air rushing in, thick with the scent of asphalt and gasoline. "License and registration," he barked, his voice a cold blade, cutting through the night. Aisha nodded, slow and careful, reaching for her purse on the passenger seat, her movements telegraphed like a plea for mercy. She fished out her wallet, fingers trembling as she pulled her ID and the crumpled registration from its sleeve, handing them over with both hands raised. The officer snatched them, his flashlight blinding her as he swept it across her face, her eyes squinting against the assault. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone even, though her chest clenched tighter with every second he stared. He didn't answer, just squinted at her license, then back at her, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Aisha Monroe," he read aloud, dragging her name like it tasted sour. "Step out of the car." The words hit her like a slap, sharp and unexpected. "Step out," she echoed, her voice quivering despite her effort to hold it steady. "Can I ask why?" He leaned closer, his breath hot with coffee and contempt. "Step out of the car. Now," he snapped louder, his hand twitching toward the holster on his hip. Aisha's stomach plummeted, her mind racing. She glanced back at Jamal, his wide eyes peeking over the blanket, fear creeping into his sleepy haze. Okay, she said quickly, unbuckling her seatbelt with shaking hands, pushing the door open, and stepping onto the pavement, the cool night air brushing against her skin like a warning. The younger officer circled to the passenger side, his boots scuffing the gravel, his hand resting on his gun as if itching to draw it. "Turn around, hands on the hood," the stocky one ordered, his voice a growl that brooked no argument. Aisha hesitated, confusion etching lines across her brow. "What's going on? I don't understand," she said, her words trembling as they spilled out. "Hands on the hood!" He roared, cutting her off, his palm slamming against the car's roof with a bang that echoed in the stillness. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, palms pressing against the warm metal, the engine's heat seeping into her skin. She felt his rough hands pat her down. No explanation, no courtesy, just a violation that made her flinch when his fingers grazed her ribs. "What are you looking for? I don't have anything," she protested, her voice cracking, fear giving way to a spark of indignation. He ignored her, nodding to the younger cop who ducked into her car without a word, rummaging through the front seat like it was his own. Aisha craned her neck, desperate to see, but the stocky officer gripped her shoulder, shoving her back down. "Stay still," he snarled, his fingers digging into her flesh. She bit her lip, tasting salt and panic, listening to the sound of her life being torn apart. The glove box clicking open, her purse unzipped, papers rustling, the clink of coins from the pouch where she kept toll money. Jamal whimpered, "Mama, what's he doing?" And her heart shattered, unable to shield him from this. Minutes stretched into an eternity, her legs trembling under the weight of helplessness, until the younger officer emerged, holding up a small plastic bag, white powder glinting inside like a cruel joke. "Found it," he said, his voice smug, a smirk tugging at his lips as he waved it in the air. Aisha's jaw dropped, shock slamming into her like a freight train. "What? That's not mine! I've never seen that before," she cried, twisting around despite the officer's grip, her voice rising into a desperate plea. The stocky one grabbed her arm, wrenching it behind her back with a force that made her gasp, cold metal cuffs snapping around her wrists, biting into her skin. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," he said, his tone flat, emotionless as if reading a grocery list. "No, this is a mistake. I don't do drugs. I've never—" Her words dissolved into a sob as he yanked her toward the cruiser, her sneakers dragging against the gravel. The younger officer smirked wider, leaning close as they shoved her into the back seat. "Tell it to the judge," he said, slamming the door with a thud that rattled her bones. Jamal's cries pierced the air, high and frantic. "Mama! Mama!" As he scrambled against the window, tiny fists pounding the glass. Aisha pressed her, face to the cruiser's window, tears streaming down her cheeks, watching her son's terrified face shrink as the car pulled away. The stocky officer slid into the driver's seat, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror, a glint of satisfaction flickering there. "Captain Grayson," the younger one called him, confirming the name she'd never forget. Her mind spun, a whirlwind of fear and disbelief, grappling with the impossible. She'd done everything right, followed every rule, and still, in minutes, her life was unraveling. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the first step into a nightmare, fueled by hate, one that would test every ounce of her strength. Aisha Monroe's sneakers squeaked against the precinct's grimy linoleum as Captain Grayson shoved her through the heavy steel door, her wrists throbbing where the cuffs cut into her skin. The air inside was stale, thick with the tang of sweat, and bleach, a stench that clung to the walls like despair itself. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the chipped counter where a bored desk sergeant scratched at a clipboard, barely glancing up as Grayson barked. Her name, Aisha Monroe, possession, he said, his voice dripping with smug certainty, tossing her license onto the counter like it was trash. Her purse, still unzipped from the search, sat beside it, its contents spilling out. A half-eaten granola bar, a spare diaper for Jamal, a crumpled grocery list, evidence of a life now dangling by a thread. She stood there, chest heaving, her braids falling loose around her face, trying to anchor herself in a world that felt like it was spinning, out of control. What had she done to deserve this? How could a night so ordinary twist into something so vicious? Grayson leaned close, his breath sour with tobacco, his pale eyes glinting with something dark. Should have stayed out of trouble, huh? Drug dealer. Vibe suits you, he sneered, loud enough for the handful of officers milling around to hear. A couple chuckled, their laughter a jagged edge against her fraying nerves. Aisha's mouth opened, a protest bubbling up, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. No call for you tonight, sit tight. Before she could argue, he shoved her toward a holding cell, the door clanging shut behind her with a finality that echoed in her bones. The cell was a concrete box, barely 10 feet square, its walls scuffed with faded scratches and stains she didn't want to identify. A single metal bench bolted to the floor offered no comfort, its surface cold against her. Thighs as she sank onto it, her hands trembling in her lap. Jamal's cries still rang in her ears, his tiny voice calling for her as the cruiser pulled away. Where was he now? Was he safe, or had they left him alone on that dark road? Hours crawled by, each minute a slow drip of dread pooling in her gut. She replayed the stop over and over, searching for a crack in the nightmare, a reason this made sense. She'd been careful, always was, knowing the stakes as a black woman in Houston. No tickets, no trouble, just a social worker pouring her soul into kids who needed her. Yet here she was, locked up, branded a criminal by a bag of powder she'd never touched. The precinct's noises filtered through the bars, boots clomping, radios crackling, a drunk man shouting somewhere down the hall. No one came for her. No explanation, just the weight of silence pressing down until her sister's voice broke through it like a lifeline. Aisha, where's my sister? Keisha's shout was fierce, cutting through the precinct's hum, and Aisha leapt to her feet, gripping the bars as relief flooded her. Keisha had come. She wasn't alone. The desk sergeant grumbled, but after what felt like an eternity of arguing and pleading, the cell door buzzed open. Aisha stumbled out, her legs shaky, and fell into Keisha's arms, her sister's familiar warmth a balm against the cold chaos of the night. "I got you out," Keisha whispered, her voice tight with anger and worry. "But it cost everything." "I had for bail $5,000. Aisha pulled back, eyes wide. "5,000 for possession? That's insane." Keisha nodded, her jaw clenched. "They wouldn't budge. Said you're a flight risk. I called in every favor I had." Aisha's heart sank, guilt twisting with gratitude. Keisha, a nurse working double shifts, had scraped together a fortune to free her, but the relief was short-lived. As they stepped into the muggy Houston dawn, two women in stiff blazers approached, their badges glinting under the streetlights. Child Protective Services. The taller one, a white woman with a pinched face and a clipboard, spoke. "First, Aisha Monroe, we're here about your son, Jamal." Aisha's stomach dropped, her hands flying to her chest. "Jamal? He's okay, right? Where is he?" The woman's lips thinned, her eyes cold. "He's been placed in temporary foster care. Given your arrest for drug possession, we've deemed you an unfit parent." Aisha's knees buckled, Keisha catching her before she hit the ground. "Unfit? That's a lie. I didn't do anything. I've got a clean record. I work with kids for a living," she cried, her voice raw, cracking under the weight of disbelief. The second agent, a younger woman with a smug tilt to her mouth, stepped forward. "Clean record or not, you're a suspect now. Your kind always slips up eventually. We're protecting the child." The slur wasn't spoken, but it hung in the air, thick and poisonous, a judgment carved into her skin. Aisha's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to breathe. "Let me see him. Please, he's scared. He needs me." The taller agent shook her head, her tone clipped. "Not until the investigation's complete. Could be weeks, months even. Aisha lunged forward, desperation clawing at her, but Keisha held her back, whispering, "Don't give them more to use against you." The agents turned away, their heels clicking against the pavement as they left, taking Jamal's fate with them. Aisha sank to her knees, sobs tearing from her throat, the asphalt biting into her skin. Her boy, her heart, ripped away by a system that saw her as less than human. How could they twist her love into a crime? What kind of world let this happen? Keisha pulled her up, guiding her to the car, but Aisha's mind was a storm of rage and fear. "I need a lawyer," she said, her voice hoarse but resolute. "Someone who'll fight this." Keisha nodded, already dialing. "I know a guy. Marcus Tate. He's good, Aisha. He's taken down cops before." Hope flickered, faint but real, as they drove to meet him. Marcus was waiting in a cramped office downtown, his suit sharp but his tie loose, a man who looked like he thrived on chaos. He listened, his dark eyes narrowing as Aisha spilled the story. The stop, the cocaine, Jamal. "Sounds like a setup," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Grayson's got pulled, though. Bail's stuck high because of him. We'll fight it. But it's a war now." Aisha nodded, steel creeping into her spine. She thought hiring Marcus would turn the tide, that justice might peek through the cracks. But as she left his office, the weight of Grayson's shadow loomed larger than ever, a predator biding his time. Could Marcus really outmatch a system rigged to crush her? Aisha clung to that thin thread of hope, picturing Jamal's face, his gap-toothed smile, the way he'd curl into her at night. She'd get him back, she had to. But the precinct's cold walls, the CPS agent's sneers, Grayson's smirk, they all whispered a truth she couldn't shake. This wasn't just a fight for her name. It was a battle against a machine that thrived on her pain, one that wouldn't stop until it broke her completely. What would it take to claw her way out? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think the system's stacked against Aisha from the start. Hit like if her fight's got your blood boiling, and subscribe to see how deep this injustice runs. Should she trust Marcus to pull her through, or is Grayson's power too much to beat? Stick around because the next twist will leave you reeling. Aisha Monroe barely slept, her body curled on Keisha's sagging couch, the faint hum of Houston's early morning traffic seeping through the thin apartment walls. Her eyes burned, red-rimmed from tears and exhaustion, but every time she closed them, Jamal's face flickered behind her lids, his cries from that night looping in her skull like a broken record. She'd spent the hours since leaving Marcus Tate's office clutching Keisha's phone, refreshing the foster care agency's site for any sign of her son, but it was a blank wall of bureaucracy, no updates, no mercy. The clock on the microwave blinked 5 minutes past 6 when Marcus called, his voice crisp despite the hour. "Got something," he said, cutting through her fog. Dash cam from Grayson's cruiser. No swerving, no nothing. "It's gold, Aisha. Meet me at the courthouse in 2 hours." Her heart leapt, a jolt of adrenaline shoving back the despair. Evidence. Real evidence. Maybe this could end the nightmare. She showered fast, the hot water doing little to ease the ache in her bones, and pulled on her best blouse, a navy one she'd worn to job interviews, hoping it'd make her look like someone worth believing. Keisha drove her downtown, the city waking up around them in a haze of exhaust and honking horns, the courthouse's gray bulk rising against a sky streaked with pink. Marcus waited on the steps, his briefcase battered but his posture sharp, a man ready for war. "The footage shows you drove straight as an arrow," he said, handing her a coffee she didn't drink. "No cause for the stop. We'll get the..." Search tossed maybe the whole case. Aisha nodded, her throat tight, clinging to his words like a lifeline. Inside, the courtroom smelled of wax and old wood, its pews half filled with bored clerks and a scattering of onlookers. The judge, a wiry woman with grey curls and a no-nonsense squint, peered over her glasses as Marcus stood, his voice steady, laying out the facts. Aisha took the stand, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles ached, recounting the stop with a clarity that surprised her. "I wasn't swerving, ma'am," she said, meeting the judge's gaze. "I asked why they pulled me over, but they wouldn't say. They just searched my car, found that bag, and cuffed me in front of my son." Her voice wavered on Jamal's name, but she pushed through, detailing Grayson's sneer, Tanner's smirk, the violation of it all. Marcus played the dashcam, the grainy video rolling on a screen, her sedan gliding smoothly down the road, no wobble, no drift, just a clean line until the cruiser's lights flared. The prosecutor, a pinched man with a slick suit, stammered, claiming officer discretion, but the judge cut him off, her pen tapping the bench. "No probable cause, no consent," she said, her tone clipped. "The search is out. Case dismissed. Pending further review." Aisha's breath rushed out, a sob catching in her chest as Marcus squeezed her shoulder, whispering, "We did it." She stumbled out of the courtroom, Keisha pulling her into a hug so tight it hurt, both of them laughing through tears on the courthouse steps. The sun felt warmer, the air lighter, like the world had tilted back toward justice. "I'm getting Jamal back," Aisha said, her voice fierce with hope, imagining his little arms around her neck again. Keisha grinned, tugging her toward the car. "Let's celebrate tonight, you earned it." The drive home was a blur of relief, Aisha's mind racing with plans, a call to CPS, a meeting with Marcus to push for custody, a return to normal. She dropped onto Keisha's couch when they got back, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave, but it was a good kind, the kind that promised rest. Night fell fast, the apartment quiet save for the hum of a fan, and Aisha drifted into a shallow sleep, dreaming of Jamal's laugh. The screech of tires outside jolted her awake, her heart slamming against her ribs as she bolted upright. The clock read 11:42, the room dark except for the streetlight seeping through the blinds. Footsteps thudded outside, heavy and purposeful, followed by a sharp hiss she couldn't place. She crept to the window, peeling back the slats, and froze. Two figures in hoodies stood by her sedan parked across the street, their faces shadowed but their intent clear. One slashed her tires with a knife, the rubber splitting with a sickening pop, while the other shook a spray can, red paint streaking across her driver's door in jagged letters. "Snitch." Aisha's breath hitched, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone, but before she could dial, a brick sailed through the air, smashing Keisha's living room window with a crash that rattled the walls. Glass sprayed across the floor, glittering in the dim light, and Aisha ducked, a scream tearing from her throat as the brick skidded to a stop inches from her feet. Keisha burst from her bedroom, eyes wide, yanking Aisha down behind the couch. "What the hell?" she hissed, peering over the edge as the figures bolted into the night, their laughter echoing like a taunt. Aisha's pulse roared in her ears, her body trembling as she crawled to the shattered window, peering out. The street was silent again, her car a gutted husk, the word snitch glowing wet and bold under the street lamp. Neighbors' lights flicked on, faces pressing to windows, but no one came out. A woman across the way muttered something sharp, her voice carrying on the humid breeze. "Serves her right, stirring trouble." A man next door chuckled, low and cruel, adding, "Should have known her place." Aisha sank back, her hands covering, her face, the triumph of the courtroom, dissolving into ash. This wasn't random. Grayson's smirk from the gallery flashed in her mind, his presence a poison that lingered. Keisha grabbed her phone, dialing Marcus, her voice shaking as she recounted the attack. He arrived 20 minutes later, his jaw tight, stepping over the glass to inspect the damage. "This is Grayson," he said, his tone grim, kneeling by the brick. "He's not done. He's got ties to the mayor, Aisha. This is retaliation, and it's only the start." She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in, her victory hollowed out by fear. "What do I do?" she whispered, her voice small, brittle. Marcus stood, his eyes hard. "We keep fighting. But you need to know what you're up against. He's untouchable, or thinks he is." Aisha nodded, her hands curling into fists, nails, biting her palms. She'd won in court, tasted freedom, thought she could breathe again. But Grayson's reach stretched beyond the law, into the streets, into her life, a venomous thread weaving through Houston's underbelly. The slashed tires, the painted slur, the brick, they were warnings, promises of worse to come. Her neighbor's contempt stung deeper, a reminder that even here she was alone, judged before she could speak. Jamal's face swam before her, his absence a wound that pulsed with every heartbeat. She'd fought for him, for herself, and won, only to fall harder, the ground crumbling beneath her. Marcus's warning echoed. A war, not a battle. Could she survive it when the enemy struck from the shadows? Aisha Monroe woke to the smell of burnt rubber and wet paint drifting through Keisha's shattered window, the jagged hole a reminder of the night's violence. Her sedan sat gutted across the street, tires slashed, the word snitch still glaring in crimson under the Houston sun. She'd barely slept, her body aching from hours hunched on the couch, her mind replaying the bricks crash, the neighbors' sneers, Grayson's invisible hand tightening around her throat. Keisha bustled in the kitchen, brewing coffee, her face drawn but fierce. "You're not giving up," she said, sliding a mug into Aisha's hands, the heat a faint comfort against the chill in her bones. Aisha nodded, sipping the bitter brew, forcing herself to believe it. She'd beaten the charge, hadn't she? The judge's ruling was a crack in the wall. Maybe she could pry it open, get Jamal back, rebuild. Today she'd return to work, face the world, prove she wasn't broken. The foster care agency sat on Houston's east side, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. Aisha stepped through the doors, her navy blouse ironed crisp, her braids pulled back, determined to reclaim her routine. Her co-workers' eyes flicked toward her, some with pity, others with something colder, but she kept her chin up, settling at her desk to tackle a stack of case files. The kids she helped, foster teens with dreams bigger than their scars, they were her anchor. She'd fought for them before. She'd fight for herself now. By noon, she'd drafted a plan to petition CPS for Jamal, her pen scratching with a fury that felt like hope. The worst was behind her, she told herself, the air in the office humming with the quiet rhythm of normalcy. Marcus called as she ate a sandwich at her desk, his voice low and urgent. "Been digging into Grayson," he said, the rustle of papers crackling through the line. "Found old complaints, beatings, planted evidence, mostly black folks. All buried, no charges. He's a ghost in the system." Aisha's stomach tightened, the bread turning to paste in her mouth. "So he's done this before," she said, her voice steady despite the dread creeping up her spine. "More than once," Marcus replied. "I'm building a file, we'll use it." She hung up, her mind buzzing. Evidence of a pattern could sink Grayson, bolster her case, maybe even scare him off. She clung to that thought, letting it carry her through the afternoon, her fingers flying over her keyboard as she typed up reports, each click a small defiance. Then the door swung open, and Ellen Carter stepped in, her heels clicking sharp against the tile. Ellen, a white co-worker with a pinched smile and a habit of hovering, had always grated on Aisha, but they'd kept it civil. Today, though, her eyes glinted with something new, something hard. "Aisha," she said, her voice too loud, drawing stares. "Heard about your trouble, rough stuff." Aisha forced a nod, wary. "I'm fine, Ellen, just working." But Ellen lingered, leaning against the desk, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm. "Good to see you back," she said, then dropped her voice. "Though some folks say you've been selling more than advice around here." Aisha's head snapped up, her pulse spiking. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ellen shrugged, her smile thinning. "To just talk. You know how it goes." The next day, Aisha's world tilted again. Marcus burst into Keisha's apartment that evening, his tie askew, a thick folder under his arm. "They've got a witness," he said, slamming the folder on. The table, papers spilling out like shrapnel. "Ellen Carter. She's testifying you sold drugs out of the agency. Swears she saw you with clients, passing baggies." Aisha's jaw dropped, shock slamming into her like a fist. "Ellen, that's a lie. I've never—" Her voice cracked, rage boiling up as she paced the cramped living room, her sneakers scuffing the worn rug. Marcus held up a hand. "No, but she's convincing a new judge. Charges are back, Aisha. Possession and trafficking now." Her knees buckled, Keisha catching her as she sank onto the couch, her breath ragged. Trafficking. A word that could steal decades, bury her alive. She replayed every moment with Ellen, searching for a clue, a crack in the woman's mask. Had she missed the venom behind those pinched smiles? Aisha grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and stormed out to confront her, Marcus shouting after her. She found Ellen at a coffee shop near the agency, sipping an iced latte like nothing was wrong. "Why?" Aisha demanded, slamming her palms on the table, the cup rattling. Ellen flinched, her eyes darting, but her voice stayed cool. "I saw what I saw, Aisha. You're not as clean as you think." Aisha leaned close, her whisper sharp. "You're lying, and I'll prove it." She hit record on her phone, hidden in her pocket, catching Ellen's stammer as she doubled down. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ellen said, but her voice wavered, a thread Aisha could pull. She stormed out, the recording a lifeline, her heart pounding with a fierce, fragile hope. This could bury Ellen's lie, couldn't it? That hope lasted 12 hours. The next morning, Aisha woke to her face splashed across the Houston Chronicle's website, a grainy mugshot beside a headline screaming, "Local social worker turned dealer mom, shocking arrest rocks community." Her phone buzzed non-stop. Texts from co-workers, clients, strangers, a flood of venom and doubt. "Always knew she was trouble," one read. "Typical," another sneered. Her stomach churned, bile rising as she scrolled, the words carving into her like knives. Grayson's hand was all over this, his smirk lurking behind every pixel. Marcus called, his voice tight. "He leaked it, Aisha. Spun Ellen's story into a media bomb. CPS won't budge now, and your job—" She didn't need him to finish. By noon, an email from the agency hit her inbox. Terminated. Effective. Immediately, reputation risk cited in cold corporate jargon. Aisha sat on Keisha's couch, the phone slipping from her hands, the room blurring as tears burned her eyes. She'd gone back to work, fought for normalcy, thought Ellen's lie could be undone with that shaky recording. But Grayson had turned her small win into ash, his influence seeping through the press, the agency, the city itself. Her job, her lifeline to Jamal, her dignity, all torched in a day. She hugged her knees, rocking slightly, the weight of it crushing her chest. How had he twisted her life so fast? Helen's betrayal was a blade, but Grayson wielded it, his power a noose tightening with every move she made. Marcus arrived, his face grim, promising to fight the new charges, but his words felt distant, drowned by the roar of her unraveling world. Could she claw back from this abyss? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think Ellen's a pawn in Grayson's game. Hit like if Aisha's recording gives you hope she'll strike back, and subscribe to catch every twist of this brutal fight. What's Grayson's next move after torching her life, and can Marcus turn the tide before it's too late? The storm's just beginning, so stick with us for the chaos ahead. Aisha Monroe sat hunched over Keisha's kitchen table, the morning light slicing through the blinds in thin, accusing streaks, her phone buzzing like an angry hive. The Houston Chronicle's headline still burned in her mind. Dealer Mom, a label that had metastasized online overnight. Hashtags like Chuck Aisha the Dealer and Chuck Junkie Mom trending on every platform she dared to check. Her inbox overflowed with venom. "Rot in jail," one stranger wrote. "Keep her away from kids," another spat. She'd lost her job, her name, her footing, but the screen glowed with a cruel new reality. A public execution by keyboard warriors who didn't know her, didn't care. Keisha snatched the phone away, her voice sharp. "Stop looking, Aisha. It's poison." But Aisha couldn't stop, her fingers itching to scroll, to fight back, to scream into the void that none of it was true. Marcus stormed in an hour later, his coat damp with Houston's sudden drizzle, a USB drive clutched in, his fist like a weapon. "We're hitting back," he said, slamming it onto the table, his eyes blazing with a fire she hadn't seen before. "Dashcam's not enough anymore. I've got it edited, ready to drop online. Shows you did nothing wrong, Aisha. Let's take it to the people." She stared at him, her chest tight with a mix of fear and defiance. The media had buried her, but maybe they could dig her out too. "Do it," she said, her voice low, steady, a spark igniting in the ashes of her despair. By noon, Marcus uploaded the footage to a local activist's YouTube channel. The video titled, "Houston PD Caught Lying, Innocent Woman Framed." It spread fast, views climbing into the thousands, comments flooding with outrage. "This is sick. Cops need to pay." Aisha watched the numbers tick up, her breath shallow, a fragile hope blooming. Could this turn the tide? That evening, a rally formed outside the courthouse, sparked by the video's wildfire spread. Aisha stood on the steps, a borrowed megaphone. Trembling in her hands, the crowd a sea of faces stretching into the dusk, their signs jagged with slogans. Justice for Aisha. End police lies. She took a deep breath, the humid air heavy in her lungs, and spoke. "My name's Aisha Monroe," she began, her voice cracking but growing stronger with every word. "I'm a mom, a social worker, not a dealer. They took my son, my life, because of a lie. I'm not stopping until the truth wins." The crowd roared, fists pumping, their cheers a thunder that shook the stone beneath her feet. Keisha squeezed her arm, tears glinting in her eyes, and Marcus nodded from the sidelines, his jaw tight with pride. Aisha felt it, a surge of power. Like she'd reclaimed her voice, her story. Was this the moment she'd dreamed of? The world finally seeing her? The high lasted until midnight. Aisha was back at Keisha's, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, when the floor vibrated with a sudden deafening thud. Sirens wailed outside, red and blue lights flooding the apartment like a nightmare reborn. She stumbled to the window, her heart slamming against her ribs, and saw them. A dozen cops in riot gear, battering rams in hand, swarming the building. "Houston PD, open up!" a voice bellowed, followed by the crack of wood splintering as they breached the front door downstairs. Keisha grabbed her, yanking her back as boots pounded up the stairs, the apartment door bursting open in a shower of splinters. Grayson stood in the threshold, his uniform crisp, his smirk ablaze. "Got a tip," he said, his voice oily with satisfaction. "More drugs, Monroe. You don't learn." Aisha's knees buckled, her screams swallowed by the chaos, as officers tore through the apartment, flipping cushions, smashing dishes, ripping drawers from their frames. She lunged forward, fists clenched, but Grayson shoved her against the wall, his forearm pinning her throat. "Stay put, junkie," he growled, his breath hot on her face. Keisha shouted, pulling at his arm, but another cop wrestled her down, cuffs snapping around her wrists. Aisha's eyes darted to the corner, where an officer found a baggie of white powder behind the couch, holding it up with a grin. "Jackpot," he said, tossing it to Grayson, who waved it in her face. "Looks familiar, huh?" Her stomach dropped, bile rising as she choked out, "That's not mine, you planted it." But her words drowned in the clamor, her pleas useless against their script. Then the beating started. Grayson nodded, and two officers grabbed her, one slamming a fist into her gut, the air rushing from her lungs in a gasp. Another cracked his baton across her shins, pain exploding up her legs as she crumpled, her cries muffled by the floor. Keisha screamed, thrashing against her cuffs, but they held her back, her voice a distant echo. Through the haze, Aisha saw a woman outside, Jamal's foster mom, phone raised, filming the chaos through the shattered window. The cops didn't notice, too busy kicking Aisha's ribs, her body curling into itself, blood trickling from her lip. Grayson crouched beside her, his voice a venomous whisper. "Rally all you want. You're nothing." He stood, signaling the others to stop, leaving her gasping on the rug, the baggie tossed beside her like a taunt. The raid ended as fast as it began, the cops filing out, Grayson's laughter lingering in the air. Aisha dragged herself up, her body screaming, every breath a knife in her chest. Keisha broke free, rushing to her, sobbing as she wiped blood from Aisha's face. The foster mom slipped inside, her hands shaking as she showed them the video. "I got it all," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "They can't hide this." By morning, the clip was everywhere, raw and unfiltered, cops planting, beating, laughing. It exploded online. Millions of views, hashtags shifting to Aisha beaten and Chakti Houston PD exposed. Protests flared across the city, chants echoing through the streets. Aisha watched from Keisha's couch, ice pressed to her swollen jaw. A flicker of triumph cutting through the pain. Had she finally struck back? But the victory soured fast. Racist trolls flooded the comments, their words a tidal wave of hate. She staged it, lying thug deserves worse. News anchors spun doubts, calling it unverified, while Grayson's allies in the precinct issued a statement. "Routine search, suspect resisted." Aisha's phone rang, a CPS worker's voice cold on the line. "Given the new evidence of a drug environment," the woman said, "your visitation rights are revoked indefinitely. Jamal stays where he is." Aisha's heart shattered. her scream silent as the call ended, the phone slipping from her hand. Keisha pulled her close, but the warmth couldn't touch the ice in her veins. The rally, the video, the crowd's roar, it had all felt like a turning point, a chance to reclaim her life. Now it was Ash, Grayson's fist slamming her back into the dirt, her son farther away than ever. She stared at the cracked ceiling, her body a map of bruises, her mind reeling. The dashcam had cleared her once. The rally had lifted her up, but Grayson twisted every win into a deeper cut. The public saw her truth but half spat on it, their hate a mirror of the cops' boots. Marcus arrived, his face grim, promising to push the video in court, to fight CPS, but his words felt like echoes in a canyon. Aisha's hands curled into fists, nails digging into her palms, the pain a tether to her fading resolve. How much more could she take? Grayson's power wasn't just in his badge. It was in the city, the system, the voices that cheered her ruin. Could she rise again when the world itself seemed to want her crushed? Aisha Munro lay on Keisha's couch, her bruised body throbbing under a thin blanket, the ice pack on her jaw melting into a puddle that soaked the cushion. Houston's muggy heat pressed through the boarded-up window, the plywood a hasty fix for Grayson's raid, but it couldn't block the echoes of boots and batons that haunted her sleep. Her ribs ached with every breath, a sharp reminder of the beating, and her swollen lips stung as she sipped water Keisha forced into her trembling hands. The viral video of the assault played on her phone, muted but relentless, its grainy frames a testament to her truth. Grayson's smirk, the planted baggie, the fists. It had sparked protests, chants ringing through the city, but CPS had twisted it into a noose banning her from Jamal. She stared at the ceiling, her eyes dry, tears spent, a hollow ache where hope had once lived. Could she keep fighting when every step forward sank her deeper? Marcus arrived at dawn, his suit rumpled, a thick stack of papers under his arm and a glint of steel in his gaze. "We've got them," he said, dropping the stack onto the table, the thud jolting Aisha upright. "Subpoenaed the body cam footage from the raid. Took some arm twisting, but it's here." He plugged a USB into Keisha's laptop, the screen flickering to life with a time-stamped view from Tanner's chest. Aisha pinned against the wall, Grayson barking orders, and then, clear as daylight, Tanner slipping the baggie from his pocket, tossing it behind the couch with a casual flick. Aisha's breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth, a sob breaking free. "That's it," she whispered, her voice raw, trembling with a mix of fury and relief. "They can't deny this." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "It's a slam. Dunk, we'll take it to court today." The hearing was a blur of polished wood and stern faces, the same judge from before peering over her glasses as Marcus presented the footage. Aisha sat rigid, her bruises hidden under a high-neck sweater, her heart pounding as the video rolled. Gasps rippled through the gallery, the prosecutor's face paling as Tanner's hand betrayed him on screen. "This is irrefutable," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Officer Tanner planted evidence. Captain Grayson orchestrated it. My client's innocent." The judge's pen scratched furiously, her lips a thin line. "Charges dismissed," she snapped, her gavel slamming down. "Captain Grayson, you're suspended pending investigation." Cheers erupted, strangers clapping Aisha's shoulder as she stumbled out, her legs weak, her mind spinning. She'd won again, hadn't she? The truth had clawed its way free. She hugged Marcus on the courthouse steps, the humid air thick with victory, her smile fragile but real. "Jamal's next," she said, her voice fierce, picturing his little face, the reunion she'd dreamed of. Marcus grinned, promising to file for custody tomorrow. She rode that high back to Keisha's, the city blurring past, protests still simmering in the streets, their chants a distant roar of support. Night fell and she sat on the couch, sipping tea, letting herself believe it might be over. The body cam had stripped Grayson's lie bare, his suspension a crack in his armor. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under, dreaming of Jamal's. Laughter, the weight lifting at last. A sharp crack snapped her awake, her heart slamming as the smell of smoke flooded the room. She bolted upright, the clock glowing 11:58, the apartment dark save for an orange flicker dancing through the blinds. "Keisha!" she screamed, lunging for the bedroom, but her sister was already stumbling out, eyes wide with panic. "Fire!" Keisha shouted, pointing to the window, where flames licked up the side of Aisha's sedan across the street, parked where she'd left it after the tire fix. Aisha ran to the glass, her breath hitching as she saw them. 3 figures in hoods, their silhouettes stark against the blaze, one tossing a Molotov cocktail that shattered against the car's hood, sending a fireball skyward. Another screamed, "Nigger snitch!" The slur cutting through the night like a blade, their laughter wild as they fled. Keisha yanked her back, dialing 911, but Aisha's eyes caught something else, a folded note taped to the broken window frame, fluttering in the heat. She ripped it free, her hands shaking as she unfolded it, the words scrawled in jagged black ink. "Testify and Jamal Burns." Her stomach dropped, a cry tearing from her throat as she crumpled the paper, the fire's roar swallowing her scream. Sirens wailed in the distance, too late. The car a skeleton of twisted metal by the time they arrived. Neighbors watched from their stoops, some filming, others muttering, but no one helped, their faces a gallery of apathy and disdain. Aisha sank to the curb, ash raining around her, the note clutched in her fist, its threat a vice around her heart. Marcus showed up as firefighters doused the wreckage, his face grim, stepping over hoses to reach her. "Grayson's behind this," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Off-duty doesn't mean out of play. He's got loyalists, Aisha." She looked up, her eyes hollow, the victory of hours ago a distant memory. "They'll kill him," she whispered, her voice breaking, Jamal's face flashing before her, gagged, terrified, a vision the note had planted. Marcus knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "We'll get protection. Move you somewhere. Safe, but you've got to stay in this fight." She nodded, numb, her body trembling as Keisha pulled her into a hug, the smoke stinging their eyes. The courthouse cheers faded, replaced by the crackle of flames and the weight of a threat she couldn't outrun. Aisha stared at the charred husk of her car, the note's words searing into her mind, a promise of violence she couldn't ignore. She'd thought the body cam was her shield, Grayson's suspension her sword, a chance to breathe, to win. But he'd struck back harder, faster, turning her triumph into terror, her son's life the bargaining chip. The rally's roar, the courtroom's gasps, they meant nothing against this. Fire in the night, a slur screamed into the dark, a mother's worst fear inked on paper. Marcus vowed to protect her, but his words felt thin against Grayson's reach, his rage a beast that wouldn't sleep. She clutched Keisha's hand, her nails digging in, resolve warring with dread. Could she save Jamal when Grayson held the match? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think Grayson's gone too far to stop now. Hit like if Aisha's courage in court has you rooting for her, and subscribe to see if she can outlast this monster. Will Marcus's plan keep her safe? Or is Grayson's next strike already lit and burning? The stakes just skyrocketed, so don't miss what's coming. Aisha Monroe stood on Keisha's porch, the dawn light painting the charred skeleton of her sedan in hues of gray and ash, the acrid stench of burnt rubber still heavy in Houston's humid air. Her hands shook as she clutched the crumpled note. Its jagged scrawl burned into her memory. "Testify and Jamal Burns." The fire had gutted her car, Grayson's warning a Molotov cocktail through her fragile hope. But she couldn't stop staring at it, the threat a chain around her heart. Keisha hovered behind her, eyes red from a sleepless night, her voice hoarse. "You can't stay here, Aisha, it's not safe." Marcus had said the same, promising a safe house, but Aisha's legs felt rooted, her mind a storm of fear and defiance. She'd won in court, exposed Grayson's lie, thought she'd struck a blow. Now her son's life dangled in the balance, and every breath felt like a countdown. A call broke the silence, the number unfamiliar but insistent. Aisha answered, her voice trembling. "Hello?" A gravelly tone rasped through, cautious but firm. "Aisha Monroe, this is Malik Jones. Used to be one of your clients. Heard what's happening. I can help." Her breath caught, recognition sparking through the fog. Malik, a wiry ex-con she'd guided through foster care years ago, now a mechanic with a quiet life. She'd helped him get his GED, land a job, escape the streets. "Malik," she said, her voice steadying. "What do you mean, help?" He paused, then dropped his voice. "Grayson framed me too back in the day. Planted weed in my trunk, got me 2 years. I'll testify, Aisha. Nail him." Her heart leapt, a lifeline in the dark. Another voice against Grayson, a pattern to prove. "Meet me at Marcus's office," she said, hanging up, a flicker of strength cutting through her dread. Marcus's office was a cramped warren downtown, its walls lined with law books and protest flyers, the air thick with coffee and determination. Malik arrived, his frame leaner than she remembered, his eyes shadowed but resolute, a faded scar tracing his jaw. Aisha hugged him, gratitude swelling as he sat, recounting his story. A traffic stop in 2018, Grayson's smirk as he found the weed, a judge who didn't care. "He laughed when they cuffed me," Malik said, his voice low, bitter. "Said I'd never prove it." Marcus scribbled notes, his pen flying, a grin tugging at his lips. "This is it, Aisha. 2 cases, same MO. We've got him squirming." She nodded, her pulse quickening, imagining Grayson's face in court, his lies unraveling. Could Malik's words finally tip the scales? The hearing came fast, the courtroom packed with reporters and activists, the air buzzing with tension. Aisha sat beside Marcus, her bruises faded, but her body tense, every creak of the pews a jolt to her nerves. The judge, stern as ever, called. Malik to the stand, his boots scuffing the floor as he swore in, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. "I was driving home from work," he began, eyes locked on the jury. "Grayson pulled me over, no reason. Searched my car, pulled a bag of weed from his pocket, not mine, said I'd regret crossing him." The gallery murmured, heads nodding, and Aisha felt it, a shift, the truth gaining weight. Grayson sat in the back, suspended but present, his glare boring into Malik, his jaw twitching like a cornered animal. Had she finally landed a hit he couldn't dodge? Marcus pressed harder, his questions sharp, drawing out every detail. The date, the street, Grayson's taunts. Malik held firm, his words a hammer against the cop's armor, the jury's faces softening, some scribbling notes. Aisha's chest swelled, hope surging as Marcus sat, the prosecutor fumbling through a weak cross, Malik's story unshaken. She glanced at Grayson, his smirk gone, replaced by a scowl that made her stomach twist. With triumph, the judge adjourned for the day, her gavel a crack of promise, and Aisha hugged Malik outside, her voice thick. "Thank you. This could change everything." He smiled, faint but real. "For both of us." She walked away, Keisha at her side, the sun warm on her face, believing she'd cornered the beast at last. That belief shattered at dusk. Aisha was at Keisha's, cooking dinner to steady her nerves, when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check the news." Her gut clenched as she flipped on the TV, the screen flaring with a breaking report. "Local man stabbed outside courthouse." Malik's face flashed up, a file photo from his old arrest, followed by grainy footage of him crumpled on the pavement, blood pooling around his chest, medics rushing in. Aisha's scream tore through the apartment, her knees buckling as Keisha caught her, the reporter's voice droning on. "Police suspect gang retaliation, victim in critical condition." She clutched the counter, gasping, the room spinning as guilt crashed over her like a wave. Malik, her ally, her hope, cut down because of her fight. Marcus burst in minutes later, his face ashen, a police scanner crackling in his hand. "It's Grayson's crew," he said, his voice tight with rage. "Witnesses saw 3 guys in hoods, same build as last night. Cops are calling it gang-related." "But it's a hit, Aisha." She stared at him, her hands trembling, Malik's blood a stain on her soul. "He's in a coma," Marcus added, softer, his eyes meeting hers. "Might not wake up." Her breath hitched, tears spilling as she sank onto the couch, the note's threat echoing. Jamal Burns. Grayson wasn't just fighting back, he was killing to silence her, to break her. The judge called an emergency session, but the mayor's office leaned in, Grayson's ties flexing and the trial delayed, citing safety concerns. Aisha's victory slipped away, drowned in Malik's blood. the system shielding its own once more. She sat there, numb, Keisha's arms around her, the TV looping the attack, each replay a knife in her chest. Malik had stood for her, risked everything, and now he lay dying, his voice stolen by Grayson's blade. The courtroom's murmurs, the jury's nods, they'd felt like a turning point, a chance to bury Grayson's lies. But he'd struck harder, faster, turning her ally into a warning, her hope into guilt. The delay stretched before her, a void where justice should have been. Grayson's suspension a hollow slap when his hands still reached through the shadows. She thought of Jamal, his life dangling by Grayson's whims, and her own, teetering on the edge of ruin. Marcus paced, promising to push harder, but his words felt like whispers against a storm. Could she keep going when every win cost a life? Aisha's hands curled into fists, her nails biting her palms, the pain a tether to her fading resolve. Malik's scar, his steady voice, his sacrifice, they burned in her mind, a debt she couldn't repay. Grayson's glare from the courtroom lingered, a predator biding his time, his loyalists a pack ready to strike. The rally's cheers, the body cam's truth, they'd lifted her up, only for this fall to crush her deeper, the ground slick with blood. She thought she'd cornered him, but he'd turned her fight into a massacre, her allies into targets. Keisha's sobs filled the silence, the apartment a tomb for their hope, and Aisha knew it. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a war where every step forward bled her dry. How much more could she lose before she broke? Aisha Monroe sat in Keisha's dim kitchen, the flickering bulb overhead casting jagged shadows across the table, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea she couldn't bring herself to drink. Malik's bloodied face haunted her, the news, replaying his stabbing on a loop, a relentless reminder of Grayson's reach. The trial's delay hung like a guillotine, her hope sliced thin by his loyalists' knives, and the note's threat, Jamal Burns, pulsed in her skull with every heartbeat. Keisha paced behind her, phone pressed to her ear, arguing with a hospital nurse for updates on Malik, her voice a tight wire of frustration. Still in a coma, she muttered, hanging up, her eyes meeting Aisha's with a shared, silent dread. How could they fight a monster who struck from the dark? Marcus burst through the door, his coat soaked from Houston's sudden rain, a wild glint in his eyes as he dropped a laptop onto the table. "We're going big," he said, his voice sharp, urgent, fingers flying over the keys. "Bodycam's too hot to sit on. I'm leaking it to national news, Aisha. CNN, MSNBC, all of them. Grayson's done hiding." She stared at him, her breath shallow, the weight of Malik's sacrifice pressing down. "Will it work?" she asked, her voice a rasp, fear warring with a flicker of defiance. "It has to," Marcus said, uploading the footage, the screen glowing with Tanner planting the baggie, Grayson's smirk frozen in time. By morning it hit the airwaves, headlines screaming, "Houston cop caught framing black woman, police corruption exposed." Aisha's face was everywhere, her story a national firestorm, protests erupting from coast to coast, chants of her name echoing through cities she'd never seen. The response was electric. Donations poured into a legal fund Marcus set up, thousands of dollars from strangers who saw her truth, messages flooding her inbox. "Keep fighting, you're not alone." She hired a security team, 2 burly ex-cops who shadowed her every move, their presence a shield against Grayson's next strike. She stood on Keisha's porch, watching a crowd gather down the street, signs waving, voices rising, her chest swelling with a power she hadn't felt since the rally. "Justice for Aisha," they shouted, and she let herself believe it, her hands steadying as she clutched Jamal's photo, his gap-toothed smile a beacon. Grayson's indictment came fast, the DA bowing to public pressure, charging him with evidence tampering and assault. Aisha exhaled, a tear slipping down her cheek, the news a lifeline she gripped tight. Was this the break she'd bled for? The high lasted 3 days. Aisha was in a safe house now, a nondescript duplex on Houston's outskirts, its beige walls and sparse furniture a stark contrast to Keisha's cluttered warmth. She sat on a lumpy couch, scrolling through supportive tweets, her security team, patrolling outside, when the ground shook with a sudden deafening boom. Windows rattled, her heart slamming as she leapt up, peering through the blinds. Black vans screeched to a halt, SWAT pouring out in a swarm of Kevlar and rifles, their shouts piercing the night. FBI! Open the door. Before she could move, the door splintered under a battering ram, boots storming in, guns trained on her chest. Aisha Munro, you're under arrest, a faceless helmet barked, yanking her arms behind her back, cuffs snapping. Tight. Her scream echoed as they dragged her outside, flashlights blinding her, the air thick with diesel and chaos. What's happening? She cried, twisting against their grip, her voice lost in the clamor. A SWAT leader stepped forward, his voice cold through the mask. Terrorism charges. Bomb threat called in. Traced to your phone. Aisha's stomach plummeted, her knees buckling as they shoved her into a van, the door slamming shut. Her dog, a scruffy mutt Keisha had brought to the safe house, barked frantically, lunging at an officer who fired once, the yelp cutting off sharp, blood pooling on the lawn. She sobbed, pounding the van's walls, her mind reeling. Terrorism? Her phone. It was a lie, Grayson's lie, but the cuffs were real, the guns too close. The safe house was trashed by morning, furniture overturned, walls gouged, her few belongings scattered like confetti. News crews swarmed, cameras rolling as helicopters buzzed overhead, headlines shifting. Aisha Munro, from victim to villain. The story spun wild, a tip claiming she'd planned a courthouse bombing, her phone records proving it, though she'd never made the call. Protesters scattered, their signs trampled, the tide turning as fast as it had risen. Marcus fought his way to her at the precinct, his face pale, slamming his fist on the table. It's Grayson, he said, his voice raw. He planted the tip, hacked your phone. Indictment didn't stop him, Aisha. He's framing you bigger. She stared at him, her wrists raw from cuffs, her dog's death a fresh wound, the world's cheers now jeers ringing in her ears. Aisha sat in a holding cell, the concrete cold against her back, her body trembling as the reality sank in. She'd become a symbol, a voice for the voiceless, donations and protests lifting her up. Grayson's indictment a crown she'd worn for 3 fleeting days. Now it was ash, her fame a weapon he'd turned against her, the SWAT raid a public execution of her hope. Her dog's blood stained her memory, a casualty in Grayson's war, and Jamal felt farther away than ever, his fate a shadow she couldn't touch. Marcus vowed to dig into the tip, to fight the charges, but his words felt like whispers against the roar of her ruin. The news played on a guard's radio, calling her a radical, a threat. The crowd's love flipped to fear. Had she risen too, high to survive the fall? She curled into herself, her hands pressed to her face, the cell's silence a tomb for her dreams. Grayson's indictment had felt like justice, the protests a chorus of strength, but he'd twisted it all, his power a hydra growing new heads with every cut. The safe house, her shield, was rubble now, her security team useless against a lie. So bold it choked the truth. She thought of Malik, bleeding out, and her dog, dead for nothing, sacrifices on an altar she hadn't chosen. The terrorism charge was a noose, tightening with every broadcast, her name a curse again. Marcus's fight was all she had left, but doubt gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. Could he unravel this when Grayson held the strings? Drop a comment with number 1 if you think Grayson's frame-up is pure evil genius. Hit like if Aisha's. Rise and Fall has you gutted, and subscribe to see if she can climb out of this pit. Will Marcus crack the terrorism lie, or has Grayson's trap snapped shut for good? The game just flipped, so brace yourself for the next blow. Aisha Munro sat on the cold steel bench of a Houston jail cell, her wrists raw from cuffs that had bitten deeper with every shove, her body a map of fresh bruises blooming under her torn sweater. The air reeked of mildew and urine, the walls smeared with grime that told stories of despair she didn't want to hear. Her ribs throbbed, a sharp ache flaring with each shallow breath, a gift from the SWAT team's boots after they'd dragged her in on terrorism charges. The cell's fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flickering like a taunt, casting her shadow in jagged angles across the concrete. Her dog's yelp echoed in her mind, blood pooling on the safe house lawn, a wound that cut deeper than the cuffs. She hugged her knees, rocking slightly, the terrorism lie a noose tightening around her neck. Grayson's smirk lurking behind every clang of the bars. How had she fallen this far? The guards came at dawn, two hulking figures with sneers carved into their faces, their badges glinting like medals of malice. "Monroe," the taller one barked, his voice a gravelly sneer. "Up!" She stood, legs trembling, her hands clenched at her sides, but before she could ask why, the second guard grabbed her arm, yanking her into the hall with a force that made her stumble. "Grayson says hi," he muttered, low enough for only her to hear, his breath hot with coffee and hate. Her stomach dropped, fear spiking as they shoved her into a windowless room, the door slamming shut with a clang that rattled her bones. No cameras, no witnesses, just the two of them and her alone with Grayson's orders. What did he want now? The first blow came fast, a fist to her gut that doubled her over, air rushing from her lungs in a choked gasp. She hit the floor, knees, cracking against concrete, but they didn't stop. Boots slamming into her ribs with a wet crunch that sent pain exploding through her chest. "Terrorist bitch," the tall one growled, his kick catching her side, her ribs snapping under the force. She screamed, curling into a ball, arms shielding her face as the second guard stomped her legs, his laughter a jagged edge against her cries. Blood trickled from her nose, warm and coppery, pooling beneath her as they rained down blows. Grayson's bribe a shadow fueling their rage. She gasped for breath, her vision blurring, the world a haze of agony and hate. Was this how it ended? Then, a clatter, faint but real. Her phone slipped from Marcus's pocket during a rushed visit, skidding across the floor from her sweater's torn sleeve. She lunged for it, fingers trembling as she hit record, the guards too lost in their fury to notice. The audio caught it all, their slurs, their boots, her whimpers, a raw symphony of brutality etched into the device. "Should have stayed quiet," one snarled, landing a final kick to her back before they stepped back panting, leaving her crumpled like discarded trash. The door slammed as they left, her body a wreck, but the phone glowed in her hand, a lifeline she clutched through the pain. Could this save her one more time? Hours later, Marcus stormed the precinct, his voice a roar that echoed down the hall, demanding her release. He'd smuggled the phone in, a desperate move, and now he had the recording slipped back to him by a janitor who'd found her bloodied but alive. He leaked it online within the hour, the audio ripping through the internet like a wildfire. Grayson says hi, the guard's grunts, Aisha's cries, undeniable proof of corruption's fists. Protests reignited, louder, angrier, crowds swarming. The jail with signs and megaphones, their chants shaking the walls. "Free Aisha!" The DA buckled, the recording a bomb too big to bury. And by noon Aisha limped out, her arm in a sling, her face swollen, Marcus steadying her as cameras flashed. She'd survived, hadn't she? The truth had pulled her from the abyss again. She leaned on Marcus, the sun blinding after the cell's gloom, her body screaming with every step, but relief flickered, fragile and fleeting. The recording had forced their hand, her blood a spotlight on Grayson's reach, his suspension now a hollow shield. She pictured Jamal, his little hands reaching for her, and clung to that image, a thread of hope in the chaos. "We'll get him back," Marcus said, his voice firm, guiding her to his car, the crowd parting like a sea. She nodded, her jaw tight, believing for a moment she'd broken Grayson's grip, that this was rock bottom and the only way left was up. But the car's radio crackled as they drove, a news report cutting through her haze. Breaking: Keisha Monroe arrested for drug possession linked to sister's case. Aisha Monroe sat in Marcus Tate's car, her body a wreck of bruises and bandages, the sling on her arm a constant ache as Houston's dusk painted the skyline in streaks of orange and gray. Keisha's arrest and Jamal's permanent removal from her life throbbed like open wounds, Grayson's latest blows stripping her to a husk of rage and despair. The radio hummed with static, news of protests drowned by the silence between her and Marcus, his knuckles white on the wheel, his jaw set, like stone. She stared out the window, the city blurring past, its lights mocking her with their indifference. Her sister in a cell, her son lost forever, her own freedom a fragile thread snapped by every move Grayson made. Could she fight when she had nothing? left to fight for?" Marcus broke the quiet, his voice low, urgent. "We're not done, Aisha. I've got something." He pulled into a parking lot near City Hall, tires crunching gravel, and yanked a folder from his briefcase, its edges worn, but thick with promise. "Grayson's bribe ledger," he said, flipping it open. Pages spilling with scribbled names, dates, amounts. A map of corruption linking him to cops, guards, even the mayor. Found it in a whistleblower's drop. He's been paying off half the precinct for years. Aisha's breath caught, her hands trembling as she traced the lines. Grayson's handwriting a venomous scrawl tying him to the jail beating. Keisha's frame-up, every cut he'd carved into her life. "This is it," she whispered, her voice raw, a spark igniting in the ashes of her defeat. Could this bury him for good? They moved fast, Marcus plotting a strike while Aisha clung to the ledger like a lifeline, its weight a tether to her fading resolve. He called a contact at a local TV station, arranging a live crash of the city council meeting that night, a public stage to air Grayson's sins. Aisha showered at his office, the hot water stinging her cuts, and pulled on a borrowed blazer, its stiff fabric a shield over her battered frame. Her ribs screamed with every step, but she gritted her teeth, picturing Keisha's fierce eyes. Jamal's tiny hands driving her forward. They slipped into City Hall's back entrance, the ledger tucked under Marcus's arm, Aisha's security team trailing close, their faces grim but steady. The council chamber buzzed with suits and murmurs, the mayor at the podium droning about budgets, oblivious to the storm about to break. Marcus nodded, and they moved, Aisha stepping into the spotlight as he plugged the ledger's scans into a projector, the screen flaring to life with Grayson's crimes. "My name's Aisha Monroe," she said, her voice shaking but rising, cutting through the room like a blade. "Captain Leonard Grayson framed me, beat me, took my family. This is his ledger, proof he owns this city's corruption." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the pages scrolled, names highlighted, payments detailed, the mayor's face paling as his own line glowed. $10,000 silence fund. Marcus hit play on the jail recording, her cries and the guards. Slurs echoing off the walls, a raw wound laid bare. The chamber erupted, council members shouting, reporters scrambling, phones raised as the feed went live. Millions watching Grayson's empire crack. Aisha stood tall, her sling a badge of survival, her voice steadying with every word. "He burned. My car stabbed my friend, framed my sister. This ends now." The crowd surged, some cheering, others jeering, but the truth rang out, unyielding. Marcus pointed to the mayor, his voice a thunderclap. "You're complicit, sir. Resign or we take this higher." The mayor stammered, sweat beading on his brow as cops swarmed in, not Grayson's cronies but feds, badges flashing, cuffing. Him mid-sentence. Grayson burst through a side door, his face a mask of fury, but the feds grabbed him too, his roar drowned by the chaos, his hands pinned as he thrashed. Aisha's chest swelled, tears stinging her eyes, a victory she could taste. Had she finally struck the killing blow? The high lasted an hour. She and Marcus stepped outside, the night air cool against her fevered skin, protesters chanting her name, cameras flashing like stars. "We'll get Keisha out," Marcus said, his grin fierce, "and Jamal's next." She nodded, her heart pounding with a hope she dared to hold, picturing her sister free, her son's arms around her. The feds hauled Grayson away, his glare cutting through the crowd, a promise of vengeance even in chains. She let herself breathe, leaning against Marcus, believing the ledger had shattered his grip, that justice might finally bend her way. But as they drove back, her phone buzzed, a blocked number, a photo loading slow. Jamal, gagged, a gun to his temple, a timestamp from 30 minutes ago. "Drop it or he's dead," the text read. No sender, just terror. Aisha's scream tore through the car, her body shaking as she thrust the phone at Marcus, his face draining of color as he swerved to the curb. "They've got him," she sobbed, her voice breaking, the image searing into her mind, Jamal's wide eyes pleading through the screen. Grayson's men, even now. Marcus slammed the dashboard, cursing, his hands trembling as he dialed the feds, shouting about a kidnapping. Aisha clutched the phone, her nails digging into her palms, blood seeping as she rocked, the ledgers. triumph crumbling into dust. The council crash, the arrests, the crowd's roar. It had felt like the end, Grayson's fall a beacon in her dark. Now it was a trap, his loyalists striking from the shadows, her son the pawn in their game. Marcus hung up, his voice tight. "Feds are on it, but we've got to move. They'll hide him, Aisha." She nodded, numb, her body a live wire of panic. And rage, the safe house raid flashing back, her dog's blood, Malik's coma, Keisha's cuffs, all leading to this. She'd aired the ledger, thought she'd won, pictured Jamal safe, Keisha free, a life rebuilt. But Grayson's reach stretched. Beyond bars, his men a hydra she couldn't slay, their gun on her son's head a checkmate she hadn't seen coming. The car sped through Houston's streets, Marcus barking orders. But Aisha's world shrank to that photo, Jamal's fear a knife in her gut. She'd struck back, hard, and won the crowd, the feds, the truth, only to lose him, the one piece she'd fought for all along. Her hands shook, clutching the phone, the screen's glow a cruel mirror of her failure. The ledger had been her sword, the council her battlefield, Grayson's arrest her crown, but it meant nothing now. Her victory a hollow shell pierced by a single text. She thought of Keisha, locked up, Malik, bleeding out, sacrifices piling, at her feet, and now Jamal, stolen from foster care, his life the price of her defiance. Marcus's resolve burned beside her, his plan unfolding, but doubt clawed at her, sharp and relentless. Could she save him when Grayson's shadow still loomed even from a cell? Aisha's scream tore through the car, her body shaking as she thrust the phone at Marcus, his face draining of color as he swerved to the curb. "They've got him," she sobbed, her voice breaking, the image searing into her mind, Jamal's wide eyes pleading through the screen. Grayson's men, even now. Marcus slammed the dashboard, cursing, his hands trembling as he dialed the feds, shouting about a kidnapping. Aisha clutched the phone, her nails digging into her palms, blood seeping as she rocked, the ledger's triumph crumbling into dust. The council crash, the arrests, the crowd's roar. It had felt like the end, Grayson's fall a beacon in her dark. Now it was a trap, his loyalists striking from the shadows, her son the pawn in their game. Marcus hung up, his voice tight. "Feds are on it, but we've got to move. They'll hide him, Aisha." She nodded, numb, her body a live wire of panic. And rage, the safe house raid flashing back, her dog's blood, Malik's coma, Keisha's cuffs, all leading to this. She'd aired the ledger, thought she'd won, pictured Jamal safe, Keisha free, a life rebuilt. But Grayson's reach stretched. Beyond bars, his men a hydra she couldn't slay, their gun on her son's head a checkmate she hadn't seen coming. The car sped through Houston's streets, Marcus barking orders. But Aisha's world shrank to that photo, Jamal's fear a knife in her gut. She'd struck back, hard, and won the crowd, the feds, the truth, only to lose him, the one piece she'd fought for all along. Her hands shook, clutching the phone, the screen's glow a cruel mirror of her failure. The ledger had been her sword, the council her battlefield, Grayson's arrest her crown, but it meant nothing now. Her victory a hollow shell pierced by a single text. She thought of Keisha, locked up, Malik, bleeding out, sacrifices piling, at her feet, and now Jamal, stolen from foster care, his life the price of her defiance. Marcus's resolve burned beside her, his plan unfolding, but doubt clawed at her, sharp and relentless. Could she save him when Grayson's shadow still loomed even from a cell? Aisha Monroe gripped Marcus Tate's car door, her knuckles pale against the dark leather, her breath ragged as Houston's neon lights streaked past in a blur of desperation. The photo of Jamal, gagged, a gun pressed to his temple, burned in her mind. Its timestamp, 30 minutes old, a ticking clock she couldn't outrun. Her ribs ached under the sling, her body a patchwork of pain from the jail beating, but none of it mattered, not with her son's life dangling by Grayson's. Threat. Marcus floored the gas, his jaw clenched. Phone pressed to his ear as he barked at the feds. "Warehouse district, old meatpacking plant, check it now," he shouted, his voice a raw edge of fury and fear. Aisha's hands trembled, clutching. The phone. Her eyes locked on Jamal's terrified face. A mother's instinct screaming to find him, to save him. Could she reach him before Grayson's men pulled the trigger? Marcus had tracked the tip, a hunch from a Fed contact, an abandoned warehouse near the ship channel, a haunt for Grayson's off-book crew. The car screeched into the industrial sprawl, its streets a maze of rusting steel and broken asphalt, the air thick with salt and decay from the nearby Gulf. Aisha's heart slammed against her ribs as they pulled up to the warehouse, its sagging roof and shattered windows looming like a tomb. "Stay here," Marcus said, grabbing a flashlight, but she shook her head, shoving the door open, her sling swinging loose. "He's my son," she rasped, her voice a steel thread, pain swallowed by resolve. Marcus nodded, no time to argue, and they slipped through a gaping hole in the chain-link fence, the night swallowing them whole. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows, its concrete floor slick with grime, the air heavy with the ghosts of old meat and mildew. Aisha moved fast, her sneakers silent, Marcus's flashlight cutting through the dark in thin, jittery beams. Her ears strained for any sound, a whimper, a footstep, anything to guide her to Jamal. Then she heard it, a muffled cry, faint but real, echoing from a rusted stairwell. "There," she whispered, bolting toward it, Marcus close behind, his breath sharp in the silence. They crept down the stairs, the metal groaning under their weight, and peered into a basement room, its walls stained with damp, a single bulb swinging overhead. Jamal sat tied to a chair, his small body trembling, duct tape over his mouth, tears streaking his cheeks. Two men in ski masks paced nearby, one twirling a pistol, the other barking into a radio. Grayson's loyalists, his venom even from a cell? Aisha's chest tightened, a sob catching in her throat, but she swallowed it, rage surging as she scanned the room. A rusted pipe lay near the stairs, a weapon if she could reach it. Marcus squeezed her arm, his whisper urgent. "I'll distract them. Get Jamal." She nodded, her pulse roaring, slipping toward the pipe as Marcus stepped out, hands raised. "Feds are outside," he lied, his voice calm, commanding. "Let the kid go and you might walk." The gunman spun, snarling, "Shut up," and lunged at Marcus, swinging the pistol like a club. Aisha seized the moment, grabbing the pipe and charging, her sling flapping as she swung it hard, cracking the second man's skull with a wet thud. He crumpled, blood pooling, and she didn't stop, turning to the gunman as Marcus wrestled him down, her pipe slamming his wrist, the gun skittering across the floor. She dropped the pipe, racing to Jamal, her hands shaking as she ripped the tape from his mouth, his sobs breaking free. "Mama!" he cried, throwing his arms around her neck as she untied him, her tears mixing with his, her body trembling with relief. Marcus pinned the gunman, knee on his back, panting as he secured the man's wrists with a zip tie from his pocket. "We've got him," he said, but the words barely landed before gunfire erupted, bullets ripping through the walls from outside, Grayson's crew closing in. Aisha scooped Jamal up, his weight straining her broken ribs, and bolted for the stairs, Marcus covering her, the gunman's dropped pistol now in his hand. "Go," he shouted, firing back, the basement a chaos of smoke and noise. They stumbled up the stairs, bullets pinging off metal, Aisha's legs burning as she clutched Jamal tight, his cries muffled against her shoulder. A stray shot grazed her arm, blood seeping warm through her sleeve, but she pushed through, adrenaline drowning the pain. They burst into the warehouse's main floor, the exit a sliver of night ahead, and ran, Marcus behind her, his shots keeping the pursuers at bay. Her lungs screamed, her vision tunneling, but she didn't stop. Not until they hit the fence, scrambling through the hole as sirens wailed in the distance, feds finally rolling in. She collapsed onto the gravel outside, Jamal in her lap, sobbing. As she rocked him, Marcus panting beside her, blood streaking his face from a ricochet cut. They'd made it, hadn't they? Her son was safe, alive in her arms. The feds swarmed, cuffing the gunmen who stumbled out, their masks torn, faces pale with defeat. Aisha held Jamal, kissing his forehead, his trembling easing as medics checked him, her own wounds a distant hum against the relief flooding her veins. Marcus slumped against the car, his breath ragged, grinning despite the chaos. "We got him back," he said, his voice hoarse, and she nodded, tears streaming, believing for a moment it was over, Grayson's grip finally broken. She'd tracked him, fought, bled and won, her son's heartbeat of victory against the dark. But the next morning, as she sat in a hospital bed, arm bandaged, Jamal asleep beside her, Marcus burst in, his face grim, a newspaper clutched in his fist. "Grayson's out," he said, slamming it down, the headline screaming, "Technicality frees corrupt cop." Aisha's stomach dropped, her hand flying to her mouth, a cry choking her as she read, "Entrapment, mishandled evidence, a judge's." Ruling sprung him free. Marcus cursed, pacing, his voice tight. "He's suing you for defamation now, Aisha. Claims the ledger's fake, says you set him up. Wants millions." Her head spun, the hospital's sterile air suffocating. Jamal's soft snores a cruel contrast to the storm crashing back. Hours later, as she limped to Keisha's apartment, released but still cuffed, a mob descended, Grayson's lies whipping them into a frenzy. Bottles flew, a Molotov cocktail shattering against the building, flames licking up the walls as screams filled the night. She grabbed Jamal, fleeing with Marcus, the fire swallowing her last refuge, leaving them homeless, hunted, her victory torched to ash. Aisha stood in the street, Jamal clinging to her leg, smoke stinging her eyes as the blaze roared, neighbors cheering the destruction, their faces twisted with hate. She'd rescued him, felt his breath against her, thought she'd won. But Grayson's release turned it all to ruin, his defamation suit a noose around her neck, the mob his fist. Her arm bled through the bandage, her ribs a cage of pain, her family shattered. Keisha jailed, Jamal reclaimed only to lose everything else. Marcus pulled her away, his car the last shelter, but her knees buckled, her screams silent as the flames danced. She'd hit the breaking point, hadn't she? Every fight, every win undone by a man who wouldn't fall, his power a tide she couldn't stem. Her hands shook, clutching Jamal, the heat searing her back as they fled, the mob's roars a chorus of her defeat. The warehouse, the pipe, the escape. It had been her stand, her triumph, only for Grayson to rise again, his lawsuit bankrupting her, his lies burning her home. She thought of Malik, bleeding, Keisha, cuffed, sacrifices piling at her feet, and now this, a mother and son adrift, nothing left but each other. Marcus's voice cut through, promising a counter, but it felt like a whisper against a hurricane. Could she keep standing when the world itself seemed to want her ashes? Aisha Munro stood in the shadow of Marcus Tate's car, Jamal's small hand trembling in hers, the glow of Keisha's burning apartment casting a hellish light across Houston's night. Smoke choked the air, thick with the stench of gasoline and ruin. The mob's cheers a savage hymn to Grayson's vengeance. Her arm throbbed under the bandage, blood seeping from the graze she'd taken rescuing Jamal, her ribs a jagged cage, of pain from every fight she'd endured. The defamation suit loomed, a $1 million noose Grayson had tightened from his newly freed hands, his technicality release a slap that turned her rescue into rubble. She'd saved her son, felt his heartbeat against hers, thought she'd clawed a sliver of victory from the jaws of defeat, only to lose her home, her sister, her last shred of safety. Could she stand when the ashes still fell around her? Marcus pulled her into the car, his face etched with exhaustion, his voice a low growl as he started the engine. "We're not done, Aisha. We'll fight the suit, find a way." She nodded, numb, Jamal curling into her lap, his sobs muffled against her chest, the heat of the fire fading as they sped away. The city blurred past, its lights a cruel mockery. Of the life she'd lost, Keisha jailed. Jamal's foster nightmare ended only to plunge into this. Her phone buzzed, dead from overuse, leaving her cut off, adrift, a mother and son with nowhere to go. Marcus drove to a cheap motel on the city's edge, its neon sign flickering, a temporary refuge paid with the last of his cash. "Rest here," he said, handing her a key, his eyes hollow but fierce. "I'll dig deeper. Grayson's not invincible." She took it, her hand shaking, hope a ghost she couldn't grasp. The motel room was a box of peeling paint and stale air, a single bed, sagging under stained sheets, a TV bolted to the wall humming static. Aisha tucked Jamal in, his small body shivering despite the blanket, His whispers of "Mama, I'm scared," a knife in her gut. She kissed his forehead, her lips trembling, and sat by the window, staring at the parking lot's cracked asphalt. The night pressing in like a predator. Every creak of the building jolted her, Grayson's shadow lurking in every sound, his loyalists a threat she couldn't outrun. She'd recorded the jail beating, aired the ledger, saved Jamal, each win a brick in a wall she'd thought would hold, only for him to torch it all, his release a phoenix rising from her ashes. How could she protect her son when the enemy walked? Free? Morning brought no relief, the sun a harsh glare through the blinds, Jamal's soft snores the only anchor in her storm. She powered on an old phone Marcus had left, its battery low but alive, and scrolled X, her name trending again, a flood of support drowned by hate. Lying scum? Grayson's the victim. Her stomach churned, bile rising as she typed, a final plea, her fingers trembling over the keys. "This is Aisha Monroe," she wrote, her voice raw even in text. "They framed me, beat me, took my son, my sister, my home. Grayson's free, suing me for the truth. I've got nothing left. But this, believe me." She attached the jail audio, the ledger scans, every scrap of proof, and hit send. The post exploding online, crashing Houston PD's site with demands, a digital riot she couldn't feel. She watched the views climb, thousands, millions, her. Story a wildfire again, but it felt futile, a scream into a void that wouldn't answer. Grayson's suit would bankrupt her, his mob had burned her out, and Jamal's safety hung by a thread she couldn't hold. She curled beside him, exhaustion, pulling her under, dreaming of Keisha's laugh, Malik's scar, a life before the stop that shattered it all. Marcus returned at noon, his suit wrinkled, a glint of something new in his eyes as he sat her down, his voice low, electric. "I've got an ace, Aisha. Tanner." Her breath caught, the rookie's name a jolt, the one who'd planted the baggie, caught on body cam, a pawn in Grayson's game. "What about him?" she asked, her voice a rasp, dread mixing with a flicker of hope. Marcus leaned in, his words sharp, deliberate. "Tanner's terrified. After the kidnapping, Grayson wired him, made him talk. I got the feds to flip him, Aisha. He's testifying, full confession, every order Grayson gave." He pulled a recorder from his pocket, hitting play. Tanner's voice trembling through static. "Grayson told me to grab the kid. Said if she didn't drop it, we'd kill him. I didn't want to, but he'd ruin me." Aisha's hands flew to her mouth, a sob breaking free, the truth a blade cutting through her despair. Marcus grinned, fierce and wild. "Court's tomorrow. This ends him." She nodded, tears streaming, clutching Jamal's sleeping form, believing for a moment she'd see Grayson fall, her family restored, justice real. The courtroom was a crucible, packed with reporters, protesters, the air thick with tension as Aisha sat beside Marcus, Jamal on her lap, his small hand in hers. The judge, stern and weathered, called order, her gavel a crack that silenced the buzz. Grayson sat across, free on his technicality, his smirk a taunt, his suit crisp despite the cuffs he'd shed. Marcus stood, his voice a thunderclap, introducing Tanner, pale and sweating, his uniform swapped for a rumpled shirt as he took the stand. "Grayson ran it all," Tanner said, his voice shaking but clear, eyes darting to his old boss. "The drugs, the raid, the kidnapping. He ordered Jamal taken, said he'd kill him if Aisha didn't back off." The gallery gasped, Aisha's heart pounding as Marcus played the tape. Grayson's voice snarling through the speakers. "Get the kid. She stops, or he's dead." Grayson lunged, roaring, but feds pinned him, his face twisting with rage as the jury scribbled, the judge's pen flying. Aisha clutched Jamal, her tears falling onto his hair, his small body trembling against her, the truth ringing out, undeniable, a hammer shattering Grayson's lies. Marcus pressed harder, Tanner spilling every detail. The bribes, the mayor, the mob, a web of corruption with Grayson at its heart. The judge's face hardened, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Leonard Grayson, you're guilty on all counts. Tampering, assault, kidnapping, corruption. Life, no parole." The gavel slammed, the room erupting, cheers drowning Grayson's curses as he was dragged away, his glare a fading ember in Aisha's victory. She collapsed into Marcus, sobbing, Jamal hugging her tight, his mama a balm on her wounds as feds cleared the room. Reporters swarming, the world shifting beneath her. Keisha's release came hours later, her sister running into her arms outside the jail, tears mixing as they held each other, Jamal between them, a family pieced back from shards. The defamation suit dissolved, Grayson's empire ash, the mayor, indicted. Houston PD reeling under federal scrutiny. Aisha stood on the courthouse steps, sunlight warm on her battered face, breathing free for the first time in months, believing it was over, her fight won, her son safe, her sister home. She'd recorded, rallied, rescued, and now triumphed, hadn't she? The nightmare ended with Grayson's life sentence, a justice she could hold. But as she turned to leave, a juror slipped past, a woman with a pinched face and a nervous glance, pressing a note into Grayson's wife's hand, unnoticed by the crowd. Aisha caught it from the corner of her eye, her stomach twisting as the woman whispered, "He's free soon," before vanishing into the throng. Grayson's wife smirked, tucking the note away, her eyes meeting Aisha's for a fleeting, chilling moment. Aisha froze, her breath hitching, Marcus pulling her away as Jamal clung to her leg, the victory souring in her throat. The sentence. Was life the tape ironclad? Tanner's confession a lock, but that whisper, that smirk, planted a seed of dread she couldn't shake. Was this truly the end, or just a pause in Grayson's war? She walked away, Keisha's arm around her, Jamal's, hand in hers, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the steps. The courtroom's cheers faded, replaced by the rustle of that note in her mind, a threat unspoken but real. She'd fought a hydra, cut its heads, thought she'd slain it, but Grayson's reach stretched beyond bars, his wife a shadow of his. Will the juror a pawn in a game she hadn't won? Her family was back, her name cleared, but the fight lingered, a ghost in the air, a whisper of worse to come. Aisha held Jamal tighter, her resolve a fragile flame, knowing one truth. She'd never stop, but neither would he. Taisha Monroe's journey reveals stark truths about resilience, systemic injustice, and the cost of fighting back. Her story teaches us that courage isn't just about standing up, it's about standing up again when every blow knocks you down harder. Aisha faced planted evidence, brutal beatings, and the loss of her son and sister, yet she wielded truth, recordings, ledgers, testimonies, as weapons against a corrupt system. This shows that even in the darkest corners, evidence can shine a light, though it often comes at a steep price. Malik's coma, Keisha's jail time, and Jamal's kidnapping underscore that justice isn't free. It demands sacrifice sometimes, from those we love most. Grayson's relentless retaliation, even from behind bars, highlights how deeply entrenched power protects its own, twisting victories into new battles. Aisha's persistence, fueled by love for her family, proves that inner strength can outlast external ruin, but the final twist, his wife's smirk, warns that evil doesn't sleep even when caged. We learn that systemic racism isn't a single fight, but a war with no clear end, where every win is fragile, every ally precious. Aisha's tale urges us to question who the system serves and to amplify the silenced, because silence lets monsters thrive. What will you take from her fight? Drop a comment if you think one voice can spark change, hit like if her grit inspires you, and subscribe for more tales of defiance against injustice. Share this if you believe truth deserves a louder stage. Thanks for joining Aisha's journey. Here's to courage that outshines the dark, and may you find strength to face your own battles.